I've been asked what the appropriate attitude towards public services should be. Statists often make the lazy claim that if you're against taxes, you should stop using the roads, which is nonsense, of course. Taxpayers are not hypocrites for driving on roads or using state services. They are victims of the state, which is nothing more than a glorified mafia. What hypocrisy is there in them using stuff the mafia bought with their extortion money? Using the roads doesn't even begin to make up for the amount of value the state has robbed from you. Also, abstaining from state services doesn't stop their existence. Non-use of public services doesn't reduce taxation or spending. But that hints at a deeper point. Yes, public property is stolen property, but that should further underscore to you just how unfree you are, that you can't avoid it. For most people, crime is thought of as something to be avoided, but that is impossible in a mixed economy. However, while it is impossible to live under a government without dirtying our hands with the proceeds of theft, that doesn't make us thieves. Everything built from coercion is a curse. It is a distortion of the natural market. That includes private property titles created or redistributed by the state, as well as firms built by subsidy and government contract, like those often found in military arms or green energy sectors. To be free, it's not enough that there is a market, but also that there is law. As Murray Rothbard said in Confiscation and the Homestead Principle, quote, "What we libertarians object to then is not government per se, but crime. What we object to is unjust or criminal property titles. What we are for is not private property per se, but just, innocent, and non-criminal private property. Justice requires that stolen property, such as public property, be returned to whomever it was stolen from. If someone was forced to sell or abandon their home or business for a public works project, then clearly that land should go back to that owner. If the project was built on virgin land, then that land was never legally homesteaded and should be treated as up for grabs by whoever is willing to homestead it. That means, for example, that public schools belong to whoever among the parents, staff, or students are willing to invest in it and take responsibility for it. There is one exception to this rule. If the state was using forced labor to build it, whether paid or not, then assuming there is no landowner who was stolen from, the laborers would have a claim as homesteaders. This is my contention. There is no good way to administer public property. It's cursed. The bigger picture is that centrally planning borders is the same kind of folly as centrally planning anything else. Libertarians already reject the central planning of capital, and of money in the form of central banks, and of trade flows in the form of tariffs. Why then should we accept the central planning of labor? Why should criminals decide who can and cannot cross an arbitrary line? Mises showed long ago that socialism requires autarky, because once you forbid price signals, you have to shut off foreign exchange to protect the lie. Of course, socialists love borders. Borders are a necessary part of their little central planning scheme. Closed borders people like Dave Smith, who I believe still claims to be an anarchist, will cry, "Doesn't the domestic population have more of a claim to the proceeds of this theft over a foreigner? And is public property just an area of chaos? Am I supposed to just sit back and allow random people into my kid's school?" He's confused. What he's missing is that a school isn't like a border. A school is an example of a monopolized industry that you're forced to use, again, like the roads. However, a border is not a monopolized industry. If it was, that industry would be a red market. That is, a market in which coercion is being sold, something that libertarian law clearly prohibits as aggression. Borders could never be a legal industry under capitalism. There is no ANCAP border policy recommendation because there is no principle-based conclusion to be applied to the borders. Talking about policy is literally quibbling about how to best run a criminal gang. In a free society, there would certainly be private property lines, but those are exclusions made by private people over the things that they own. They are not preventing people from moving over unowned land, which is plainly aggression. Those from traditional schools of anarchy get this right away. But those who come in from the right wing seem to have as much of a hard time letting go of identitarian abstractions, like the national community, as modern liberals, if not more. They will claim immigration is forced integration and thus a violation of freedom of association. But the truth is everyone is coerced to associate with everyone else under the state. In trying to prevent forced association with outsiders, you are reinforcing the coercion inside. How do you know the people around you wouldn't prefer you weren't here? And why should you care what they want? In any case, you can't claim that getting approval from the state proves you're more wanted by the domestic population. Besides which, the truth is if someone can survive in your country, then they are wanted. If they are employed, it means their employer wants them in their business. If they are renting, it means the landlord wants them in their building. If they buy things, it means the store owners want their patronage. If they take taxis, it means the driver wants them on board. You want to talk about the will of the people? Well, there you go. The people have spoken. ANCAPs will correctly point out that the police should protect private property from violent rioters. But perhaps I need to remind them, the only reason it's acceptable to cheer on police in that context is because they are doing what everyone is within their rights to do. No one has the right to invade private stores and homes, and thus we all have the right to stop that and to help protect people from socialists. It's good when a police officer stops a rioter or a fireman saves a kid from a burning building, but that in no way, shape, or form means that the state is legitimate. It's simply a fact that if we try to do the job ourselves, they will treat our acts of defense as criminal, especially if you're in Canada. I can oppose crime without supporting the police, much like how I can oppose terrorism without supporting the existence of the American or Israeli states. Forced association between native taxpayers and immigrants is manufactured by the state via public infrastructure and welfare. That is an argument against the state, even if you did like whoever you were being forced to associate with, not against people. But that forced association is not an argument for turning a country into a prison. You decry the surveillance state and the tracking of people, but border security is part of that same apparatus. ANCAPs don't cheer for border guards because someone crossing a border isn't engaged in an act of aggression. There is no victim and therefore no crime, and thus no excuse for cheering on police in this context. They may argue that it saves law enforcement costs, but again, the enforcement of what law? Why are you worried about the costs of the law being enforced when the law includes the war on drugs and prohibiting you from owning the means to protect yourself? Why are you worried about the workability of the state at all? Since when do natural rights need to be limited by how well state institutions can tolerate them? We would never support the limitation of speech, property, or expression because it strains public services. What Dave Smith wants to do with borders is what his opponents in the Israel debates want to do. They want to imagine they are freer than they actually are. They want to pretend that the statist identity they are fighting for is less criminal than the other criminal gangs, and therefore it is somehow ethical. It's not that Dave should accept random people walking into his kid's school, it's that he should stop looking for policy that makes sending kids to public school a good idea. He should stop propping up this boomer conservative fantasy that we can live free lives in the meanwhile. We're not free at all, Dave, and it's your job to remind people of that, not sell them on the dream of good government. If you were talking about putting a wall up around your neighborhood, then it would make sense to weigh costs and talk about price estimates. But the state is not your homeowners association. And freedom isn't about weighing the costs and benefits of coercion. The state is a mafia, and libertarianism is not about improving national management. It's about rejecting the collective ownership lie itself. Borders and public lands aren't just poorly run. They are impossible to run justly because they are criminal. And there is no such thing as a principled statist policy.